Making a quilt is such a fun and rewarding sewing project and can easily be done by those who are new to sewing. I'm Jan Howell. Welcome back to my channel. In a previous tutorial in my quilting series, part 3, I showed you how to use the backing fabric of your quilt to bind the quilt. But in this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to cut strips, sew them together, and add them to your quilt. One thing I like about adding strips of binding to your quilt is you can use different fabric that's in your quilt to add contrast, color, and it's really quite simple to do. So without any further ado, let's get into it. The materials and items that you'll need for binding the quilt is, of course, a contrasting color of fabric, and we'll go over that in just a minute. You'll need some clips, fabric clips. I really like these clips, or you can use just regular sewing pins. You'll need a pair of fabric scissors. I like using a rotary cutter and a rotary mat and ruler to cut my strips with. Just so much easier and so quick to do. You'll need a measuring device. You can use just the seam gauge or of course a measuring tape. You'll need your sewing machine, an iron, and if you want to bind the quilt using a needle and thread, you will need a needle and thread. The first thing that we're going to talk about is choosing the fabric for your binding. I like to take different pieces of fabric. So as you can see, this is my dog blanket that I'm making for my dog. It's a small denim patchwork quilt, and I have on the back a plaid piece of flannel. You can cut strips of the same fabric if you don't want a contrast, or you can add different colors, prints to add a little contrast, which I like to do. I like to tape swatches of fabric, place them behind your quilt just to see what it would look like. And I think that stripe would be really cute. And of course, and on the other side, it will look cute as well. Once you've decided on what fabric, now we need to cut the strips. This binding is cut on the straight of grain, and it's not on the bias like some things that you'll cut binding strips for. And we'll be cutting the strips 2.5 inches wide. But how do you know how many strips or how long it needs to be? I'm going to give you a formula that you can print out, you can use to know how much binding you'll need and how long you'll need. I will put the PDF downloadable in the description, so you can print out that formula so you can have it on hand to look at. You'll start by measuring the width and the length of your blanket. Now this small quilt, the width measures 38 inches, and I'm going to times that by 2, which makes it 76 inches. So I'm going to jot that down, 76 inches, and the length is 43 inches, and I'll times that by 2, which is 86 inches. Now I'm going to add the 76, the width doubled and the length doubled. I'm going to add those together, which gives me 162 inches that I'll need. So for this binding, I have used a wider piece of fabric. So it's wider than a normal bolt of fabric. I measured my binding and my strips ended up being 64 inches long. So I need to know how many strips I need to make. I'm going to divide that 162 inches by 64 inches, which is the length of my strips, and I get 2.53. But you want to round that up. I'm going to round that up to 3. So I'm going to need just 3 strips cut by 2.5 inches and 64 inches in length. So I have 3 joints that I need to make. So 3 times 2.5 inches is 7.5 inches. So I'm going to add to that total length of 162 the 7.5 inches for the joints. So that means I'll need 169 inches total. It's good to have longer than not enough when you come to the point where you're sewing on your strips. I hope that makes sense. I'll have the printable formula that you can download, and I'll put that in the description. Because of course you can make your quilts any size. So how do you join your strips together? I'm going to show you a way to reduce the bulk of the bias, because if you sew just right down here, you're going to have a lot of bulk in one area on the binding, which can be really bulky and it doesn't look so great. So to make that less bulky, we're going to take the right sides together at a 45-degree angle like this. I'm going to overlap that about 1/4 of an inch. Now it doesn't have to be exact, but you want it to overlap a little bit. Can you see on those ends? And then I'm going to sew from that little notch there down to the notch, that little V notch there. So it's an angle. Now I just eyeball it. If you feel uncomfortable with that and you need more of a guide, you can just take your ruler or a straight edge and mark that from that point to this point. And that's where you'll sew. And so I'm going to do that for all 3 pieces, join that together. And let's go to the sewing machine and I'll show you how that's done. I have set my machine to a straight stitch, length 2.5. I have put my 1/4 inch presser foot on, and if you have a walking foot like I do on this Pfaff machine, you might as well use it because it helps when you're sewing with multiple layers and thick layers. But if you don't have a walking foot, no worries. I'm going to get set up by taking my strips and just placing them on my lap, so I'm not sewing 2 ends of the same piece together. So I'll take my first piece, place it right side facing up, take another strip and place it right side facing down. Again, I'm going to overlap the ends about 1/4 of an inch, and then I'm just going to eyeball it, that line, or you can, like I showed you before, mark that out. I'm going to place the presser foot down right in that little notch there, that V, and that's where I'll start sewing. So I'm ending right in that little V. I'm going to back stitch a few stitches. I'm not going to cut it yet. I'm going to bring the end of that piece, place it right side facing up, take my new strip, place it right side facing down, leaving that extra 1/4 inch, and sew this one together. So to trim off that excess fabric on that corner, take your scissors and leave about 1/4 inch and cut it off just like that. And you'll have these little ears there, fabric ears, that you can just clip those off. And see, so when you open that up, you have that continuous strip. And when you fold it over, not all of the bulk is going to be in one place. It's distributed evenly. So I'm going to do that for all the joints. And with this one, I only have 2. You can press those if you want to, and I think I will do that. Just take it to the ironing board and press those seams open. There are a couple different ways that you can sew on the strips of binding. You can sew the whole thing with the sewing machine, or you can sew it on and then hand stitch the binding on the other side, which I really enjoy doing, especially with a smaller quilt like this. It's just a relaxing thing for me to do. It's just so relaxing to sit down and watch a TV program and hand bind the quilt. But if you want to sew it by hand, by the machine both ways, I will show you both ways. If you want to sew it by hand, you'll sew the binding to the front side, and then you'll fold it and wrap it over to the back side and then hand stitch. If you want to use the sewing machine, you'll sew it to the back side first and then flip it over to the front side. So I'm going to put the top side of the quilt facing up, and I like to start in the middle, either at the bottom or the side of the quilt. And we're going to leave about 8 inches to 10 inches unsewn, and that will be for joining the binding when we go all the way around. Fold your strip in half, and I really don't like to press my binding, because when you're sewing it on, if you have a crease there, sometimes the binding will shift a little bit and it can get a little wonky. I just like to leave it unpressed. I'll bring the wrong sides together, and then I'm going to place it along the edge of the quilt. When you put your pieces together, you're going to have batting sticking out, and some of the fabric might be a little wider, so you just need to square up your quilt first and get all the edges even like I have here. You can use the scissors or a rotary cutter if you want. So my edges are all even. I'm going to start by just clipping this in place. You don't want to pull the fabric taut. You'll just lie it on top. And then of course when you're sewing, you can ease and adjust that as you need. And I'm not going to pin the whole quilt together. I'm just going to kind of hold it and sew as I go. And this piece of fabric just kind of is fraying pretty good. Now, as you can see, I'm not going to start at the end. I'm going to come in about 8 to 10 inches and just start sewing. And then I'm going to show you a little trick about sewing those mitered corners that'll come out really nice. So let's take it to the sewing machine, start sewing the binding onto the quilt. So my cut edge is on the right, my quilt is on the left. I have left that extra binding, and I'm going to just start sewing, making sure that those edges are even. I'm using a 1/4 inch presser foot. If you don't have that, you can just use a regular presser foot and sew. Adjust your needle if you need to the right, or to get that 1/4 inch seam allowance. You'll sew just a little bit and then adjust as you need to, making sure those edges are lined up. I'm not going to pull this taut. I'm just going to let it loosely lay on top of the quilt as I sew. So this denim makes it a little bit more challenging because it is quite bulky, but it's still very doable. And these denim quilts end up being so cute. Okay, so there's our first joint, and see how that's at an angle. When we get to the corner, let me show you what we're going to do. Now see how there's a little bit of overlap here, and there's the fabric isn't quite lining up. So I'm going to take my scissors and cut that back piece a little bit right there, so it's even. And you may have to do this for on a few places. Sew down and stop at 1/4 inch before the edge here. So see how this presser foot has these lines on it right here. This one is the 1/4 inch mark. So if I were to sew down and bring that line to this edge in alignment with that edge, that means I'm at the 1/4 point from the edge. Let me show you what that looks like. So I'm going to sew down. When this line lines up with the edge of the quilt, you can mark it with a pencil or a pen if you really wanted to. So that is the point. I'm going to leave my needle down, lift up my presser foot, and pivot it so that you can sew at an angle to the point. So I'm just going to sew off and come out right at that point. I'm going to lift up my presser foot. I'm going to fold it up, fold it down, making that a square edge. And I'm going to place that fold with the top edge of the quilt there. Line up the edges on the side here. I'm going to continue sewing down to the next corner. And you can also trim the excess off after you've sewn it together, which I may do. Okay, so we're getting close to where we started. I'm going to stop here so we have some room to work with to join those other edges. I'm going to stop sewing there and bring it over to the table so that we can mark where we need to join those edges, and I'll show you how that's done. I have left these long tails. That gives us some room to work with, and I'm going to bring that down and then cut that off about halfway there. Then I'm going to bring this excess over the top. I'm just going to let that lay flat without pulling it. And I'm going to leave it so I can kind of see where that end is. I'm going to put a pin there so I can see where that end is. And then I need to measure 2.5 inches more on this long piece, and you can mark it with a pen where you need to cut. Remove the pin. I'm going to take it back to the sewing machine. You want to make sure that it's not twisted. So right side facing up, right side facing down, just like we did on those other joints, extending it past about 1/4 inch. Let's go back to the sewing machine and make that joint. Pull up your quilt so it's not pulling down so that you can easily sew this. Got our right sides together, overlapping. I'm sewing from corner to corner. You don't need to back stitch because we're going to sew this right to the quilt soon. Now before I cut anything off, I'm going to take it to the table, lie it flat, and make sure that it's fitting. All right, so I'm going to lay the quilt flat, and that is just perfect. See how that's not too tight, it's just even. Now that I know that that is the right length, now I can cut off that excess corner. I'll cut those little tails off. Line up my edges. I'm going to clip that in place. Open up that seam allowance just so, and finger press it. Less bulk. And I'm going to start sewing where I left off, sew all the way down. Of course, back stitching here, so all the way down and overlap a little bit and back stitch. Finding where I left off, I'm going to overlap it a little bit, stitching. I'm going to back stitch. Before we go any further, especially when we're working with some bulky fabric here, so I'm going to just check for places that didn't get sewn. Make sure it's all attached. And at this point you can also trim off any excess fabric. Let's see how that is overlapping just a little bit. I'm going to trim that off because we don't want any bulk. When we flip that over to the other side, you don't want to have extra bulk. And it's easier on quilts that are quilted to the edge, then the edges stay together better. But where this is just tied, you have all those and the edges that can fluctuate a little bit. Also checking seams. We caught the fabric evenly. So there's some more bulk there. And I think we're good. So now we can go to the next step. Now we can fold it to the wrong side or the right side, whichever way you're doing. I am going to take it to the ironing board and press. I'm going to pull that open as much as possible and press that out. Press this seam allowance towards the binding and pulling it out as much as possible. You'll just go all the way around your quilt. The next thing to do is start folding your binding to either the front or the back. And see this stitching line? We want to make sure that it's going just past that so you don't see that stitching line. And I like using these clips, or of course you can use pins. And like I share in the other tutorials with these clips, is on these clips there's a rounded side and a flat side. And if you're doing this on a table, take that rounded edge and it will slide better than trying to scoot it underneath with that flat edge. So scooping that under. Now you can you can clip the whole thing, or I kind of like to do a portion at a time. Remove and then add more clips. And I think you have more control sewing it by hand than you do with the machine, but it just depends how you want to do it. So I'm going to show you both ways. Now let me show you how those mitered corners are going to look. This is what's really cool. So see how that's kind of sewn like that? No worries, that's how it's meant to be. And we're going to flip that to the front. And I'm going to place pins or these clips. And then you're going to just fold that over. And it'll make that natural mitered corner. Let me show you on another corner. Fold it down, and then flip up that other side. And it leaves that little mitered corner. Let me show you first how you sew it by hand. See, look how cute that stripe is. All right, so to sew by hand, thread your needle and knot the end. And an easy way to, let me show you how to knot the end. A really easy way is to bring the thread down to the end, wrap it around your finger a couple times, and then just roll your fingers together and pull, and it'll make that knot. I'm going to take a stitch just somewhere inside there so we don't see the knot. I'm going to fold the binding over that seam so you don't see it. Then I'm going to take a stitch in the fold of the binding. I'm going to bring my needle down right where that seam, where that thread came out, take a stitch, not going through all layers, just a little stitch, and then bring it back up into the fold of the binding. Take another stitch. And you can get, so you can do that all in one motion, bring it back up into the fold. Insert the needle right where the thread come out, take a little stitch, and then up into the fold of the binding. So this is just an enjoyable thing for me to do. And let me get down a little bit further so I can show you what it looks like. So there you have it. You don't see any stitches here. You don't see any stitches there. And ta-da, that's it. I'm just going to leave that needle in here and go to the sewing machine and show you how you would do it with a machine. I'm going to start just before the corner so you can see how that is done. I'm going to fold that over, making sure I'm going past that seam, and I'm going to come in and back stitch. And when I get to that corner, I'm going to leave my needle down, lift up my presser foot, and pivot. And let me show you what that looks like on the other side. So we've sewn in far enough that it's not going to sew into the top piece. Like I say, I think you have more control when you stitch it by hand, but that is what it will look like with the sewing machine. I hope this tutorial was helpful. Look how cute that stripe ended up being, and just imagine all the cute things that you can do with this binding. You can use this binding technique on placemats, fabric napkins, and other things that you want to add a binding to. I hope that inspires you to get out your sewing machine and make a quilt. It really isn't that hard. Make sure you're watching the other 2 videos in the quilting series, part 1 and part 2. And for other crafting and sewing tips, check out my website, youmakeitsimple.com. Make sure you like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comment section below. Have fun sewing, and we'll see you in the next video.